Fundamental to this is the question of creativity versus productivity. Most of our education system is about being productive within an existing structure. It's not about standing beside that.
In
It's
fact, we
not
need more sweepers now with Swachh Bharat. But anyway,
true
because we are in this Amrit Kaal, how people would be learning in 2047.
information, but you to learn a way of being in the world which is more engaged, which is more just. The question of breakfast, and then it was like bun, it was eggs, it was
Egg.
toast, and then somebody said that there are a lot of people who eat what their mother brings back from the home in which she works in, as a domestic servant. What is around you, and you're learning from a wisdom which you don't recognize, what is called folk wisdom, but it's actually a certain Hoshangabad Vigyan, as they call it. They very carefully use the word Vigyan. This is an old fashioned way of thinking about education. And I think for us, the idea of consumption needs to be related to the question of learning, right? Meaning that there is an emphasis on textual knowledge continuity rather than being able to do something with your hands and with your brain, which is stands apart from.
Welcome to the Gyaan Project, previously known as Audio Gyaan. Before we start, please consider subscribing to the channel and head on to thegyanproject.com and share your email to get the latest update. Let's dive in. What does it mean to learn in today's world of reels, AI, and short attention spans? In today's episode of the Gyaan Project, I'm joined by Professor Dilip Menon, a global historian, Mellon Chair of Indian Studies at University of Witwatersrand, and a science breakthrough winner, who spent years exploring how knowledge travels across time, oceans, and culture. If you are just a student, parent, or just curious about why our education feels broken, this episode will shift how you think about learning itself. Here's Professor Dilip. Welcome, Dilip sir, to the Gyaan Project, and thank you for giving your time.
No, it's a pleasure. I'm very glad that you have me on this to speak about issues which I've not really given much consideration to until you asked me to.
Yeah. No, the idea is to just document in this series what is learning. So I'll start off that it is said that when a student is ready, the teacher will appear. So, who, according to you, is a teacher and a student?
I'll answer the first part of your question because I think some of our conversation will drift to the second part of what you asked.
Hmm.
I think one of the advantages and problems with these Zen-like statements, it addresses a very solipsistic individual, somebody who's a self-contained individual. That the whole question of education becomes something about individual preparedness, about being ready to learn. The idea, the Zen metaphor of the teacher and the student, and there's a glass, and the teacher asks the student to pour water into it, and the water overflows, and he says if the glass is overflowing nothing can go into it, and so on. But I'd like to think about this question that you asked more practically,
Hmm.
because the question really is about availabilities as much as capability, because this addresses the question of the capability of the student. But we have to also ask, where does the student come, what is available to them? So, for example, questions of funding, right? Very in India, and particularly in the landscape of inequality that we live in, not everybody has access to good education, to good schools. So this question of the student being ready, you can always have an eklavya who's always ready, right?
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
then this
Hmm.
leads us to the question of exclusion, that a lot of people do not have access to education, and this becomes a major problem in societies such as ours. The third question is that of priorities. What does the student want to learn? Are there institutions that exist and teachers that exist that can provide that? Because very often there is a mismatch between what people want to learn and the education that is available to them. And we can
Hmm.
see this in our engineering colleges, we can see this in our schools, we can see this in our institutions of higher education, that the necessary expertise is lacking. So you go very much like somebody goes to a temple, you go to what the temple can offer you, right? You
Hmm.
cannot ask anything of the institution. You have to go with what the institution gives you. So it's less about the student being ready and the teacher appearing than a whole set of other issues as well. So, for example, if you were to reverse this question, flip this question, and ask
Hmm.
and put it this way, that a teacher paradoxically is one who is willing to learn, right? Rather than the
Hmm.
one who teaches. So Paulo Freire, the South American intellectual, asked, what is it that a teacher can learn from a classroom? And this is
Hmm.
the question, fundamental question, that I think is not explored in many of our spaces of learning, where the student is not seen as an equal participant. It is always a hierarchical relationship. It's like the relation between a pujari and a devotee. You go to the
Hmm.
temple and something is dropped into your palm. Your prasad
Hmm.
is dropped into
Hmm.
your palm. Sometimes the pujari doesn't even touch you because you're not the right caste. And this is really the structure of our society with regard to education as well, that you
Hmm.
have to take what is given to you from a position of superiority. I would argue that it's the dynamics of the classroom that establish who is a teacher and who is a student. Do you see what I mean?
Hmm.
Right?
Hmm.
There are
Hmm.
no prior positions.
But in case of Guru Shishya,
The idea of Guru Shishya is a very hierarchical caste notion. It presumes a
hmm.
hierarchical relationship. There is somebody who's already in possession of all knowledge that there is, right? Somebody who
Hmm.
doesn't need to know any further. I am asking you to invert the relationship. What is it that the teacher can learn from the student? What is it
Hmm.
that the teacher can learn from a classroom? What does the teacher know of the classroom within which he or she teaches? Right? One assumes that all classrooms are alike. They are not. In every year, there is a different group of students who come to the school with different life experiences, different capabilities. The teacher is completely unaware of all of this. When a teacher is ready, the student will appear, is how I would like to pose it.
Beautiful. In fact, I remember one of my friends and I was discussing this, that if the student fails, the teacher is supposed to be punished and not the other way around.
I would agree up to an extent, because if somebody tries to teach me the violin, I don't know how capable I am. I should be punished.
Like, what are the trade-offs, right? Like, I mean, yes, there's one caste angle that you brought in. What has happened over when the formal education also came in, the industrial revolution, we needed more skilled laborers. What are those dynamics, and in that context, how does this fit in?
I think this question of what are our sources of information, that is an important question to ask, and I think I will explore this question of the industrial revolution further.
Hmm.
But when we think about this question that you've raised about history, culture, folklore, there's a multiple sources of information, and this question of the new media, right, which a lot of
Hmm.
people are very allergic to, are very alarmed by, and so when people talk about artificial intelligence, it's always with a sense of anxiety.
Hmm.
What will happen to us, what will happen to the human, those kinds
Correct.
of questions. But I think fundamental to the question of education is something that's been ignored in an earlier era and continues to be ignored in the current era, this question of autobiography, right?
Hmm.
The question of where do we come from, who are we, where we move outwards from a knowledge of who we are to questions of neighborhood, to questions of locality, questions of notion. And when we ask the question, who are we are fundamentally getting closer to the question of understanding a landscape of inequality. And over the
Hmm.
last 20 years, I've been reading Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's work, and this has been crucial to me, where I do not come from a Avarna caste, right? And so, in the schools that I have studied, in the spaces that I've occupied, in the universities that I've taught, the experience that I've had in my life is very different from a
Hmm.
lot of the experiences of my students. This is what I mean about learning from the classroom. So, when we understand this landscape of inequality, we have to proceed from outwards from autobiography. And this question of asking the fundamental question of learning, what prevents me from thinking? And this is a difficult question to ask. What is it that I
Correct.
cannot think about? Right? And you
Hmm.
might think that this is, that this requires you to jump out of your skin, right? But what prevents me from thinking? Secondly, what do I take for granted? Right? And
Hmm.
very often we take our privilege for granted. We take for granted that people lead the same lives. See, one of our things that we're told in school is that we are all equal. We are not. In that
Hmm.
classroom, there are people with fundamental differences of experience, access, wealth, etc., etc. The third question we have to ask in education is, how does my caste and class position enable or disable me? This is what everybody has to ask, the teacher as much as the student. So none
Hmm.
of these questions have really been the question of education is a very abstract idea. We study something called physics, we study something called chemistry. We don't ask the question of who are we in relation to the others that we are with. How do we change that so that we create a different future? So, this has never been the function of an industrial society education or in a post industrial society education, this question of social relations. So, the fundamental question is how do we understand what goes without saying, right? What is not said, not what is explicitly said. Ignorance, the darkness that lies at the heart of our classroom, at the heart of our education. What are the lives worth speaking about? What are the experiences worth speaking about? So, we are taught the biographies of great men, we're taught history, we're taught this, that, and the other. But fundamental to that is the prior question which you're not asking. What is the life worth telling? Why do we not tell the life of the scavenger, the guy who cleans
Hmm.
the shit and dies, right? In the sanitation worker who's condemned to that life. That's not a part of our education. Because for us,
Hmm.
that is not a life worth telling. We have to speak about the NASA scientist, we have to speak about the IIM graduate, and so on. But it is actually becoming sensitive to the world around us, the spaces around us. Who can enter the space that we occupy, whether it's an office, whether it's a classroom, a hotel, a restaurant, a mall? Who are the people who are not there? How do we think with that? Right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Understanding what goes without saying, understanding what we do not see, understanding exclusion. So, this is where I think we have to think about a way of education where we encourage students to write blogs. Getting
Hmm.
back to the question of autobiography, who am I? Where do I come from? What is it that I don't know? That is the most difficult question. The question of using the camera, engaging with artificial intelligence, where it's not just a textual knowledge, that we have to
Hmm.
encourage students to move outside of the classroom, to look into themselves, look around them, look at what they cannot see, and ask the question, what is it that I'm prevented from seeing? Right? So I
Hmm.
think there's a whole set of things there which is not about disciplines. You can study chemistry and be taught chemistry in the most excellent manner possible, but it
Hmm.
doesn't make you a better human being. And in the end, education has to be about that. We have the sufficient intelligence to engage with everything else.
Particularly saying that should we understand the why part of it or the what part of it? Because when you say what, then you bring in a lot of context to it. Like, I'm more curious about the why, that why am I being taught this
Yeah,
over the other? So do
exactly.
you see that as a different?
Yes, you have to ask when you're taught something, what is it that I'm not being taught? Right? It's
Hmm.
like when you shine a torch, for example. It's what you don't see. It's what is called the penumbra, like the umbra and the penumbra, which we learn in school. So when you
Hmm.
shine a torch, the light actually excludes. We tend to think
Hmm.
that the torch highlights, but that highlighting is a mode of exclusion because it creates darkness around the edges. Right? And
Hmm.
that's the question that I'm
Beautiful.
asking.
So the economic survey of 2023 and 24 says that almost 50% of the graduates are unemployable, right? So do you see this to be like a skill gap because of the torch thing that you mentioned, that we are focusing on something while ignoring what is not known, and thereby the whole system itself is kind of skewed in a way?
Yeah, actually, the whole question here is of what we mean by employable, right? And what
Hmm.
constitutes employment. Because in a society such as ours, and if you were to say, अच्छा मैं गाना गाता हूँ, that is not considered employment, right? Or मैं
Hmm.
stand-up comedy करता हूँ, that's not considered employment. To be a doctor, engineer, IAS officer, police officer, and so on and so forth. So we have a certain notion of what employability is, which restricts the understanding of the individual self, that human beings are capable of much creativity, right?
Hmm.
And if somebody were to ask me to advise their child on, okay, now what is your future going to be, I say I don't know. My father could not advise me because the world had moved on beyond his time, and I
Hmm.
cannot advise somebody because the world has moved on beyond my time. So artificial intelligence, IT, has created such an explosion of possibilities. Think about the people making millions through Instagram, right? So when you think about
Hmm.
all of that, so it comes to the question of what do we mean by employability? What do we mean by employment? What do we mean by skills? And very often our educational policies are an inheritance from an industrial past, right?
Hmm.
So our educational systems are lagging behind because they are about creating people who will service an industrial economy, whereas the world has changed. So things like time structure, you go to school from 8 to whatever it is.
Hmm.
Questions of discipline, cutting your hair, this becomes a major issue in schools. I don't know why.
Hmm.
Wearing a uniform, all of this are preparing you for the time discipline of an industrial capitalism. It's not about creativity, it's about conformity, it's about
Hmm.
fitting in, it's about subjecting yourself to a certain kind of discipline. So the question is that when we think about the relation between schools and employability, I would think that there is very little relation between schooling and employability,
Hmm.
that people become employable despite the fact that they've been to school and university, right? It's a question of creativity. Think about what you yourself are doing, right? I mean, if you were to think about the schooling that you had and the creative space that you occupy, right, there is very little. It's something that you have done on your own. So,
Hmm.
this question of how do we think about higher education? How do we move away from a concentration on texts? Right? This is something that we know all through school, which is why we have these questions of dyslexia and, where if you are unable to read a text, this is seen as a sign of failure rather than asking what is the skill that you have that allows you to access another space. And so engagement with internet, digital, and we'll get onto a conversation about this, where again there's a very dystopic vision of the internet and of digital media, right? That this is
Hmm.
somehow, messing with our brains. Fundamental to this is the question of creativity versus productivity. Most of our education system is about being productive within an existing structure. It's not about
Hmm.
standing beside that. It's not about being creative. It's about information rather than skills, right?
Hmm.
And this is actually goes back again to the way in which our society is constructed, where if I were to put it very simply, it's about the distinction between a Brahmin and a Shudra education, right?
Hmm.
Meaning that there is an emphasis on textual knowledge, continuity, a mastery of certain texts, rather than being able to do something with your hands and with your brain, which is stands apart from the texture and the
Hmm.
inheritance. Because, in some sense, the inheritance is what sits heavy on our shoulders. We need to shrug it off and move on. Education should be allowing us to do that. So, that's really this question. So, this 2023-2024 survey about employability skill gap, I think, is still addressing some previous questions, some past
Hmm.
questions, which I think we need to move beyond.
Correct, correct. Yeah, yeah. Anyway, like we have been taught that smart work is better work than hard work. But
Exactly.
why we do we want to classify smart work and hard work, right? Like there is something which needs tactical intervention, there needs something which philosophical intervention, and these two have their independent existence. I think that
Absolutely.
that is not the common narrative, I believe.
No, in Kedar, and many years ago, there was this. I mean, when at the time of the Mandal agitation and so on, many IIT graduates said, we can't get jobs with all of this. And many of them said, now we'll be condemned to become sweepers, right?
Hmm.
And a lot of them took up brooms. And so I thought to myself when I saw that video, I won't employ them as sweepers because they don't know how to sweep. The way they were handling the broom was completely inefficient. They had no idea what they were doing. So I think
Hmm.
this coming together of intellectual and manual is what we need, bringing together what we see as Brahmin and Shudra modes of life, right?
Hmm.
And this is the fault. And I think people don't think about this sufficiently as to how our education is structured by our social attitudes and by the fact of where we are as a society. We imagine that we are studying very much like people would study in Singapore and the US and Europe and so on, but it's not happening.
In fact, we need more sweepers now with Swachh Bharat. But anyway, uh, yeah. So, could you tell us a little bit about how language influences learning, right? And especially, I was going through your article about lessons from India on decolonizing language. So,
Mhm.
why language or why learning as such is tied to colonial or post-colonial era?
Actually, this is a very interesting question and a very large question because we tend to see language as something that is very functional. Ki
Hmm.
idhar aao, wo karo, those kinds of things, or for communication, right? That
Hmm.
you ask me a question and I'm able to provide an answer that is to the point, and it ranges from everyday acts to swearing at someone or to declaring your love for someone. Language is very, very, very functional. But we have to understand that language is something that we speak, but language is also something that speaks through us,
Hmm.
right? What I mean by this is that language shapes one. So the kind of tone that one adopts, the kind of vocabulary that one uses is also inherited. We are not conscious of this. And this is something that I would like to stress throughout, right? In this conversation that we are having. And when we grow up with a bare exposure to language, right, where language becomes merely about communication, then we find it difficult to think complex thoughts. And what I mean by that is where you use the language to make something new, not merely to trade with what you've inherited. Because if you think about this question of language, language is also about hierarchy, right? Who you say
Hmm.
tu to, who you say up to, all of this is structured, and very often this is unconscious, right?
Hmm.
Because when we see somebody, when we see a chowkidar or when we see a person who occupies a position of authority, our language changes. We don't
Hmm.
use the same language, we don't use the same tone. There is the idea of the language of command and the language of hierarchy and the language of respect. So, language is not a simple thing, right?
Hmm.
And this is something that we need to understand. So when we get caught up in things like the three language formula, for example, and
Hmm.
at independence we actually conceived of six languages. I don't know whether you know this. So you would study Persian or Sanskrit, you would study a foreign language, and all of those are very interesting. And I myself speak four languages because I've grown up in Maharashtra, I've grown up in Bengal, I've grown up in Kerala and in Delhi. So for me, it's an inheritance that comes from this engagement with the different varieties of language and the different ideas that are implicit in the language as well. So, this
Hmm.
question of why is it that in India we are unable to think new thoughts, right?
Hmm.
When we think new, we think in English. We don't think in our languages. Our languages we use for speaking to our mother, our lover, our friend, but we don't theorize in Marathi. We don't theorize in Malayalam, in Tamil, and so on. We reserve that for English. This disables us because the
Wow.
language that we have, the mother language, mother tongue that we have, is our deepest possession. It is who we are. But we don't theorize with that. We theorize with the language that comes from elsewhere, right? And that is the wound of colonialism. It is what Ganesh Devi, the uh, linguist, called the,
Linguist.
yeah, where he says we live after amnesia.
Hmm.
Colonialism has created the amnesia of the resources that we have in our language. So we think with theories that come from somewhere else because we don't use language. We don't use the language that is so rooted in the circumstances around us. So to go back to Ambedkar again, I mean, so the question is we can say, what do we want? If you ask somebody, what do we want in our society? What is the Constitution about? And you'd say equality, liberty, fraternity, the great ideals of the French Revolution.
Hmm.
But the thing is that equality and liberty you can pass as laws, put it into the fraternity is a fellow feeling. This you
Hmm.
cannot legislate, it has to happen. So, how does that happen? How do we create that fellow feeling? How do we ask the question, do we have a society? Right? We just assume we have a subject called sociology, which is premised on a study of society, and therefore we assume there's something called society, whereas our society is actually created through, it's not a face to face society, it's a back to back society where people
Hmm.
don't relate with each other, they don't eat with each other, they don't marry each other, right? If you fall in love with the wrong person, you could end up dead and 10 feet under the ground and killed
Hmm.
by your own relatives, right? So when you think about all of this, we have to ask ourselves, language determines how we think. We assume that we have something called a society. We don't. We are not even halfway there. We are unable to treat another human being as an equal. So then we have to ask ourselves, What does our language allow us to do? Does our language allow us to emancipate ourselves, or to just take society as it is? We assume, okay, there is something called Indian society, whereas in fact there isn't. So I think the question of language that you've asked is a very complicated one. We have to
Hmm.
step outside of this entire inheritance and think differently.
I understand. Ganesh Devi has been on the show before,
Ah,
so
he's a
yeah, they have
brilliant
spoken.
man.
So then, how do we differentiate between, say, learning, knowing, and in the current time, just consuming content, right? When my dad or someone sees like a reel, they think, oh, I got it. Like there are 5-minute crafts and somebody fixing a flip flop, and like, oh, I got how to fix something, right? So, what is the harm in that? What does meaningful learning also mean?
No, I think this is an important question, and it goes back to something that we talked about earlier. That for us, education and knowledge is about what is in the head and not what is in the hand, so to speak.
Hmm.
Right?
Hmm.
And so when
Hmm.
people say that, look, what you have is a whole generation that is just consuming content, and the idea is that of a passive person in front of a screen or front of a phone in their hand. Like, for example, my son who reads, but he also watches a lot. He knows the names of all the countries in the world, he knows the flags, and he can identify through a game. You give him one part of a flag, he can identify which country that flag belongs to. He
Hmm.
knows multiple things because he's watching. So it's a different mode of learning. Now it's a question of what one watches. Right? One can watch pornography, or one can watch do it yourself, or one can watch things that relate to cooking, exercise, language, geography, quizzes, how to fix a tap, how to fix a leak in the plumbing, how to fix your fuse if your fuse blows. All of that is available. So it is consuming towards learning, right? So not mere passive consumption. So one of the things that this whole space of digital media has allowed us is to actually learn skills which we have not been taught in our school, right?
Hmm.
Immediately when there's a leak, you think, aha, I'll call a plumber, right? But here you can actually watch a video and fix it yourself. And for me, this has been very, very useful for fixing things around the house. Is also, like when my son's birthday, to make he loved Minions, the
Hmm.
cartoon
Hmm.
character. So how to make that out of fudge for the cakes, and I learned it on a YouTube video over 1 hour, and I made those minions. So I think the thing is that one has to have this idea of an education that comes to us through digital media, where we use YouTube, we use Instagram, use all of this to learn. It's not
Hmm.
only through books. Ki kitab padho is what we are told, right? This is an old-fashioned way of thinking about education, because that education is about memorizing, it's about information, it's not about creativity. And I think for us, the idea of consumption needs to be related to the question of learning. Think about the number of people, and this really during COVID was when I think a lot
Hmm.
of people became aware, right? Where suddenly people who are allergic to Zoom, for example, started figuring out how to use it. People started going on to online courses. People stuck during hard lockdown had to do things at home. They got onto the net. How do I fix this? How do I do this? And so,
Hmm.
this question of text and expertise, that was the older relation. Now, we need to think about the idea of the digital media and expertise, and how everyone can become their own plumber, for example.
Hmm.
So, those, I think we have to think about digital content in a very deep and meaningful way. Right? And I think this idea of passive consumption is one model. And it's a worst case scenario, but you can't dismiss something by looking at the worst case scenario. You have to think about the
Hmm.
possibilities. How do we
Beautiful.
move beyond the classroom to a period thing of life, process of lifelong learning? Where you're
Hmm.
constantly asking yourself, what don't I know and how can I learn it? And I think the net allows has allowed me to do that.
Would you classify the type of content here? Because Q has always been towards algorithms, and then the misuse is more, is what the overall sentiment feels like.
So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, if you keep watching porn, it'll give you more porn. If you keep watching videos from which you can learn, it'll give you more videos from which you can learn, right? So
Hmm.
the algorithm is not something that stands outside and determines what you watch. The algorithm is an interactional thing, right?
Hmm.
So if I could watch more and more creative videos, and more creative videos will come my way. No, and I think and in one sense, I think people are not thinking sufficiently about this new medium. Do you see what I mean? And there's a dismissal of the possibilities. I mean, I can see only immense possibilities. Of course, there are ways in which you're being manipulated. Of course, all of that is true. But I think we still have a degree of control over what we can watch. And which is why we need to produce content, right? We need to put more content in there, but I'll go on to talk about this later.
Okay, so yeah, we'll continue this in a bit, but then could you tell us a little bit about the importance of interdisciplinary learning also? Like, I come from a science background, but because of my art angle, I went into design. And with the GAN project also, the idea is to be as interdisciplinary as possible, from all sorts of creative endeavors to just confining it to design per se, right? So I believe in it, but if I have to like understand your perspective, that what's the importance of it, and has STEM sort of learning created more silos, or are there ways to fix it, or does it need to be fixed also?
No, I think this again is a very large and vast question, this question of interdisciplinarity, because I think we work with the idea of what long ago C.P. Snow called two cultures. We make a hard line, we draw a hard line between humanities and arts and the sciences. So STEM is like something quite different.
Hmm.
And then you're also caught up with these questions of hierarchy within the schools. Ki the best students will go for science, and because I did rather well at school and I chose history, the students, I mean, my teachers are very disappointed. Ki, history kyun kar rahe ho? You could have done
Hmm.
mathematics or physics and so on.
Hmm.
So there is a larger hierarchy of all of this. But the question is, what is education for? And that's the question where the interdisciplinarity comes in. If you're thinking about a job, right, and which is what really how we still continue to think very crudely about education, that is going to provide you some kind of employment. We've dealt with this previously as well. So this question of creativity, question of, so for example, if I study history and now we're given the digital media, I have to engage with some degree of interdisciplinarity, where I have to understand the ways in which technology functions, I have to have some basic idea of image, of physics, right, in order to produce, let's
Hmm.
say, a program on history for the YouTube, right? So, in that sense, if I have to think about outreach, I have to think creatively. So, interdisciplinarity is something that is required of all of us. We can't be shut off in our
Hmm.
silos, because the idea of the silo is related merely to employment. It's not to a expansion of the spirit, it's not to creativity. So mathematics, logic, these are all necessary in everyday life. Think about the Hoshangabad Vigyan experiment. I don't know whether you've heard about this, in the 70s and the
No.
80s, where in Madhya Pradesh, and this is something that people like Anita Rampal were very at the heart of. They went on to teach at Delhi University subsequently. The
Hmm.
Hoshangabad Vigyan experiment was really about how do you go to villages and learn from forms of knowledge which know nothing about. So, question of raising plants, growing crops, biodiversity, watching the
Hmm.
skies. Where the laboratory is not in a building; it's a mobile laboratory,
Hmm.
right? You're learning from what is around you, and you're learning from a wisdom which you don't recognize. What is called folk wisdom, but it's actually a certain Hoshangabad Vigyan, as they call it. They very carefully use the word Vigyan, that this is a science. And here is where we are talking about science not merely as that which is enshrined in laboratories, experiments, and so on and so forth, right? And in IITs and in antiseptic spaces, but we're thinking about how people are learning geometric patterns from nature. People are learning how to engage with maintaining crops in the middle of drought, in the middle of attacks from insects, multiple things like that. So, this question of interdisciplinarity is a requirement. It's not a textual requirement, it's an existential requirement,
Hmm.
right? And that's how we need to understand interdisciplinarity, not like, acha, let's read Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking, right?
Hmm.
That's the way that people look at it. And this again requires us to work with one's hands, to do
Hmm.
experiments, to not about repetition, right? It's not about tradition, it's not about repetition, it's about experimentation, it's about creativity, it's about realizing that the knowledge of the world has to be scientific, right? In
Hmm.
terms of engaging with the very processes of nature. So, physics is not just about Einstein and theory of relativity, but it's about the ways in which the world is organized around us. So, I think that's
Hmm.
how I understand interdisciplinarity.
Beautiful. In fact, that I remember, I interviewed Sarovar Zaidi, who's an anthropologist, and
Uh-huh.
she got interested in colors. We spoke about colors and communities, and she got interested in colors because she didn't wanted to confine her thinking to, I think, Newton's color theory, but what does it do to emotions? What does it do to more other human aspects of
Mhm.
psychology? Weird to like compartmentalize.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
actually that's the wound of our education. Like that
Hmm.
T-shirt, popular T-shirt goes, "I was intelligent and then I went to school."
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So we spoke about the interdisciplinary piece, also difference between learning, knowing. We also touched upon the influence of language. Maybe another dimension, that how do historical events, politics, cinema, and obviously culture shape what we are taught or what we consume, and then how does it influence us in our thinking, and then what is that form of learning?
Right, and this is, I suppose, all this question can be subsumed under the larger category of the WhatsApp university, which is now the reflex in which we relate to anything that is circulating on the net. And of course, there is much that is circulating on the net without reflection, without verification. There's bullying, there's shaming, there's inciting people to action. All of this is happening, right? And but it's like the old example that's given, that you can give somebody a knife and they can use it to carve something, or they use it to kill somebody. The same with any kind of technology as well, right?
Hmm.
So how do we think about, for example, WhatsApp? And one of the things that is happening increasingly, I'm in South Africa, but all over Africa, a lot of schools are using WhatsApp as a kind of educational supplement. So, for
Hmm.
example, whatever is taught at school, the students then WhatsApp their teacher and ask to what they did
Oh.
not understand, or can you give me more examples. Then the teacher sends stuff on WhatsApp, because mobile, the data is cheaper, right? So
Hmm.
the WhatsApp then becomes a mode of education, of teacher follow up and so on, also allowing students then to know how to use digital technology. Because when you have a phone in your hand, it's a very, very powerful instrument. It allows you access to online classes, it allows you conversations, it also allows you to circulate nonsense. I mean, but we're leaving that out of the picture. So, the other thing to ask is, how do we build an alternative historical consciousness, right? Right now, anybody and their mother and their dog is commenting on Aurangzeb and partition and Muslims. All kinds of stuff is going on. But if you think about Gresham's law, about bad money driving out good, right? But good knowledge also drives out bad. But we have to think about that creatively. How do we use WhatsApp and YouTube and so on to create forms of knowledge which are more inclusive, more just? And we need to think about the fact that, if we go back to our initial question about school
Hmm.
projects are about doing some exercises from the textbooks. Right? What if we were to make homework about asking students to go with their phone to record what is around them, to record what migrant laborers around them, how do they live, what does that teaches them a lot about the phenomenon of global capitalism, much better than abstract ideas about Marx and capitalism. How do you
Hmm.
understand what happens in the home, the hierarchies within the home, the domestic servant who is in your home, who is the unequal person within your space of equality. Think
Hmm.
about what one eats, document that. Like one of the very interesting questions that was raised when the NCRT textbooks were revised around 20 odd years ago was the question of breakfast.
Hmm.
What do people eat for breakfast? And then it was like bun, it was eggs, it was toast,
Egg.
it was cornflakes. And then somebody raised the question, okay, this is all very well, but there are a lot of people who eat what their mother brings back from the home in which she works in as a domestic servant. That's what they eat for breakfast. Right? So these kinds of questions which are never considered by our education. Education where we can get students to go out making videos, engaging with the world, and to post these online. That's how
Hmm.
we create a new world and we create a new human being. The student learns what is missing in their education, and others who watch us realize what has been missed out in the years of education that they have had, and to get back. Good knowledge can drive out bad. And so I think it's about it's a new world we are living in, Kedar, and we have to engage with that new world differently. But a lot of
Hmm.
people are resisting. All they have is this kind of old fashioned distrust, and they're not willing to learn. Right? It's
Hmm.
so easy with a phone in your hand to not just record people being beaten up, but to actually use your brain to create content. Anyone can do this. And that's also
Hmm.
a form of employment instantly. Because as you know, if you start posting things on YouTube, you can, if number of views, you can generate money, right? And a
Hmm.
lot of young people have caught on to this like that with a snap. I mean,
Yeah, no, it's so empowering and so positive because like this took me a few years back where I was listening to Pula Deshpande, one Marathi
yes, of
play.
course.
Yeah, he's a great person.
Extraordinary individual.
So he said that when tape recorders came, there were two options, and you know what happened. One was when you are actually in a lecture, can you
Mhm.
record the cassette and listen to the entire recording back home again as a homework, or
Right.
you could just buy some cassette and dance at in the evening, right? So
Mhm.
it's finally the technology, and then how do you use it?
And our education system has to focus on creativity rather than
Hmm.
learning by rote repetition, and then you'll find the shift happening.
So one practical tip, right? Like I mean that now I have stopped reading like really long articles, or
Right.
I've stopped also dealing with pain, right? I mean I distract myself somewhere.
Right.
I like in my close friend circles and WhatsApp groups and everywhere, people have kind of not very good dealing with disagreements, or tolerance has taken a new shape because of certain distractions. Attention span is diminishing. What do you think about this, right? Like
I think we have to cultivate a new attitude, Kedar. I mean, and to give you I mean, this is something that I struggle with, right? So when I have the phone in my hand, the tendency is to look at Facebook or do, something. And so over the month of February, I put my phone aside. So when I was reading, I was reading. And there was that at the back of my brain, there was this thing of kind of like a twitch, where you want to
hmm,
reach out for a phone to check, has somebody commented on something that I posted and so on. But I wasn't doing that. And over the course of February, I read and reviewed 5 books. Right. And I thought to myself, this is the cost.
hmm,
Right? This is
hmm,
the cost that I'm facing, that my constant engagement with media is a substitute for what I actually need to be doing and what makes me happy. Because at the end of it, I looked at the work that I'd done and I was genuinely happy. Apart from the
hmm,
fact that there was a greater alertness because I was focusing on a page for 2 or 3 hours, get up, go for a walk, and so on and so forth. So I think what we need to do is to de-link, right?
hmm,
De-link from this engagement, constant engagement technology, waiting for the next WhatsApp message. So is to allocate time. We do this in our lives, right?
hmm,
We
hmm,
allocate time for various things. Some people will allocate an hour for prayer. There's some people are able to fast for a whole day, right? During Ramzan, which is what is going on right now. All of that requires concentration. So we have to tell ourselves that we need to de-link from an engagement, a constant engagement with media. And it's not very difficult because once you get into the habit, as I realized, where the
hmm,
first day when I was sitting and reading, there was this thought constantly, but after a while, it just became what I was doing. And this also means that our sympathy span increases, right? Where it's
hmm,
not only about our attention span, that when we watch something, we where we are not getting this overload like the genocide that's happening in Palestine. You watch 50 videos and then already your brain is looking for something that is slightly more exciting than the last one.
hmm,
Right? You forget the human tragedy, and then it's become like, okay, now tell me something else. So I think all of this is pausing, delinking, moving away, creating a space for yourself, All of this is necessary. And I think this has to be an individual enterprise. I don't think there's a solution. You have to tell yourself to do this.
Mm.
Just as you make space in your life for exercise, for prayer, for time with your children, you have to create a space for yourself where your brain is actually, it's like working out at the gym, right? And your
Mm.
brain is actually concentrating on focus, right? Whether it's on reading or on music or whatever it is.
Yeah. I'll add my bit also to the listeners that I'm trying this disciplined approach for almost last 2 years, and I am failing terribly, but I'm not given hope because I am reading James Clear on an ongoing basis, and it's a practice. It's not
Right.
like you have made a timetable and then you'll stick to it. You will fail 100 times, but the whole idea is to come back and try it again.
Yeah, that's
So
sadhana for you, and riyas and all of those things, that words that we know. But
yeah, yeah, correct. Cool. So, Dilip sir, I wanted to conclude with one last question, and it's more of a speculative fiction or however you want to
mhm.
position it. But person like you who's been studying the past so well, how do you imagine knowledge or learning happening in the future? And because we are in this Amrit Kaal, how about like how do people would be learning in 2047 or something of that timeline?
Yeah, actually, this is an interesting question, and I don't know how intelligent one can be with this, because whenever you think about science fiction works with what we know,
Hmm.
right? We can only project from what we know. We can't project from what we don't know. And if we create a vision of the future that is so disconnected from what we know, then it becomes merely outlandish. It appeals to nobody. So I'll try
Hmm.
and answer your question with the handicap that I can only think with what I know, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So the first thing would be that right now, I think for me, the most important thing is to try and come to terms with the possibilities of artificial intelligence, right?
Hmm.
To move from the aggregative forms that were existed earlier to the more agentive forms, as they're putting it. Right, earlier, as you know, in ChatGPT and so on, it's not creative. It just summons up everything that is there and distills it for you in the space of a second.
Hmm.
So, how do I engage with artificial intelligence intelligently, not merely with this dyspepsia, this is nonsense and this is curtailing human intelligence and creativity and so on, where I have to think about artificial intelligence as enabling my work
Hmm.
and enabling me to proceed further. So, for example, a lot of the routine stuff that I do when I write papers, right? The referencing and so on. Now it's all can be done for me, right?
Hmm.
And so it leaves me with less of the boredom of research and more of the creativity. So I think by 2047, hopefully we'll have arrived at a stage where we are engaging with artificial intelligence to imagine new scenarios, to think and create more knowledge, creating a knowledge that is different from what we already possess. Secondly, I think to go back to your first question, I would like to imagine that given this, that students will be generating the disciplines that they are taught, right?
Hmm.
That students are able to then, through an engagement with the possibilities of AI, through the possibilities of using their cell phones and so on to record what is around them, to record life rather than something that is incarcerated or buried in a text, in a textbook, that it becomes a much more live enterprise, that the classroom becomes a much more mobile category, right?
Hmm.
And I mean mobile in the sense of a pun as well, right? That students are saying, bringing to the classroom knowledge that they are able to generate from what is around them, of inequality, of beauty, or whatever it is. The third thing is that our education will be more and more experimental rather than merely learning by rote towards
Hmm.
employment, towards learning the like for example, when I was at uh, 15, 20 years ago, when people began engaging with IT at school, they would study diagrams of the computer and of the
Hmm.
mouse and of the keypad, right? Without actually having seen a computer at all. because some schools couldn't afford it, and otherwise it's again this thing of continuing with older forms of learning. Keep parts of the computer, like we study parts of the cockroach in biology. So learning how to be in the world through experiments, through making stuff, where we go back to the idea of interdisciplinarity, that science is not a subject, right? It's not a stream. Right? After class 10, you decide ye karenge ya wo karenge. It's not about that. But it's something that is integral to a part of our life. And finally, I think where we realize that, as I said, good knowledge must drive out bad. How do we get there? And we learn how to be in the world, not where education, hopefully in the future, will be not just about gathering more and more and more information. Right? Like you find a lot of people saying, "Acha, हमने जो BA में पढ़ा था, आप class 12 में पढ़ रहे हैं." That's not progress. It's not about more information, but you to learn a way of being in the world which is more engaged, which is more just, which is more compassionate, which understands the first question: what is it that I cannot think?
Beautiful, beautiful. I think on that note, we can conclude. It was lovely talking to you and actually got to know a lot of stuff. It was great having you. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Kedar. Thank you for provoking this all of this thought in my own conventional ways of thinking, because I think your questions did allow me to get back to what is it that I had not been systematically thinking through. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I had a great time speaking with Professor Dilip, and I hope you did too. Thanks for staying till the end. And since you are here, do check out the show notes for all reference links. If you like this episode, hit the subscribe and the like button, and please share it with your friends and family. You can also sign up for TGP Samachar, 4 interesting finds from across all episodes. Follow us on social media and recommend a guest. And join our WhatsApp channel. For now, it's just updates, but with your support, it could be an active community. Thanks again for listening. See you soon in the next episode.